All right, so let's talk about one of my favorite tools in your marketing toolkit. It's called the persona. Now, before getting into what it is and how we use them, I want to talk about one very important concept: worldviews. You have your own worldview, I have my own worldview, so does everyone else. And they've all been influenced by our experiences, our education, and really our interactions with others. And so your worldview, it's that lens that you use to make sense of the world. It's the thing we use that kind of separates the important information from the unimportant. Now, they're not always accurate, but usually they help our brains figure out what information needs our attention and what else can be ignored. So because of that, worldviews not only shape your thoughts and your views and your perspective, but they shape your behavior, which would include your buying behavior, or in this case, your customers' buying behavior. Mad Men, very popular TV show. It's been published over 40 times in the New York Times, but yet it's still viewed by only less than 1% of the US population. On top of that, think about Netflix. All of the shows, the independent films, the documentaries, all of the content that's on Netflix that never would have ever seen a shelf in Blockbuster. Amazon, anybody can write a book, can publish content and post it on Amazon. Getting it on a bookshelf in Barnes & Noble back in the day, it wasn't going to happen. So what we're learning is it's never been easier to distribute content, products, or ideas. So in a world that's kind of flooded with all these options, the stuff that is built for everyone kind of gets ignored. And so the strange stuff, the weird stuff, the stuff on the edges, that's what's getting attention. And so the dynamic of this world we live in, this is what Chris Anderson calls the long tail, which essentially is just talking about the possibility of marketers to now segment outliers and still come away with a pretty profitable business model. And then what we find is that over time, if you focus on these people on the periphery, you're not only going to have a tribe of very passionate people excited about what you do, but your ideas and your worldviews and maybe even your products are more likely to spread to other people, because that's what we're drawn to, is the stuff that's remarkable, the stuff that gets our attention. Try answering the following question: who will miss you when you're gone? Think about that. As a business owner, as a marketer, I see it as you have two very important tasks. Your first task is to identify, one, who these people are, and two, what is it that you can offer that'll actually make them miss you? And, for the first question, it's not going to be everyone. It can't be. Our worldviews shape not only how we see the world, but how we see ourselves in it. We create identities about who we are. So consider like drinking tap water versus bottled water. Is one worldview better than the other? I mean, there is no universal answer for that, right? There's pros and cons either way. It's kind of fuzzy. I mean, bottled water isn't really better for the environment. However, how many places exist today without safe, clean drinking water? There's no universal culture that governs all of the decisions we make. Instead, we're seeing countless, I'll call them microcultures, sprout up, where they're really just giving anyone who's willing to step up the opportunity to lead the people within them and to make change happen. So for that reason, I think it's important we as marketers give tools that help us understand the worldviews of the people around us a little bit more attention, right? And the persona can do just that. Its primary purpose is to help us make sense of the worldviews of others around us. We'll explore this in greater detail later, but stories are one of the best ways to communicate with others. So think of a persona as writing a short biography of your customers. Here's a big reason why personas are important. As humans, we're constantly filtering out information, trying to make sense of the world around us. And one of the quickest ways to filter out information is unimportant is to abstract it away. He took it kind of to a bit of an extreme, but at the same time, he had a point here. It's that our brains, we're not evil beings, but we can't help but try and filter out information. And the issue is, if you're a business owner and if you don't really understand and appreciate and empathize with the group of people you're trying to serve, the chances of you producing something that they're actually going to want to buy is going to be greatly, greatly diminished, right? So personas essentially help us make people more real. So building personas is a bit of a cyclical process consisting of 3 steps. The first step of the persona loop is to get inside of the minds of the people you serve. Now, there are a variety of methods to do this, and I'll give 3 that I found that are pretty useful that kind of depend on your time and your access to these people. The easiest method I found is to simply observe them in their element. So people watchers love this approach because you don't need to say anything to anybody. You just simply observe how they interact with their environment. What do you hear them say? Who are they interacting with? What are they posting on social media? Which, by the way, observations, now that we have all this access to technology, when you're shadowing or observing someone, they don't always have to be in the same physical space as you. You can find out what people are saying online and what they're doing and tracking what really interests them. But the point of this is you want to figure out what they spend their time thinking about. And finally, what conclusions can you draw based on your observations? I mean, that's the whole point. Do you know enough to answer why they do what they do? So the drawback with this approach is you don't always get the most reliable information. You also can't always understand their motivations because you're not necessarily talking to them. You're just observing kind of from afar. So you don't always know exactly why they do what they do, which, of course, so the big drawback here is some of your assumptions may not be as founded as you'd like them to be. So the next approach is a bit more involved and might be able to get more of what the motivations of your customers really are, and that's talking to them, interview them. So this one's pretty simple. You get some time with them, whether over the phone or in person. You can buy them, breakfast or something like that, or a cup of coffee if you're into that thing. But the point is, you come prepared with a few questions, and I'll post some of the questions that I like to use below and kind of give you an interview guide that I use to kind of prepare for these things. But here's some tips that I found when conducting an interview. The first thing is to think and act like a journalist. Okay, so what good journalists should be doing is being more like a passive observer. People know you're there, but you don't necessarily have an agenda. You shouldn't have one. It should be more about documenting facts. What are you hearing them say? And just drawing as much as you can, but you're hearing it directly from them, quoting them, recording them, and all that fun stuff. So the first thing is adopt the mindset of a journalist. You're no longer a business owner or anything like that. So with that, step 2, talk very little, right? When you're talking, you're not learning. The third thing, don't sell anything. That's the quickest way to get someone to shut down and say goodbye. We get it. There's a lot of people that have a lot of cool ideas for us that need our attention. Don't be one of those people whenever you talk to these people. If they're taking time out of their lives and their day to meet with you, view this as a service and honestly as a compliment to you and your integrity as a business owner. And you don't want to jeopardize that by trying to shove more products and ideas in front of them right now. This is about them. The fourth tip for interviewing is to ask why a lot. And there's different versions of why, because you don't want to sound like the annoying 2 or 3-year-old that just keeps asking why and why. But it's true. You want to figure out why they say the things they say. So ask questions like, what makes you say that? Why is that so? I mean, there's all these different versions of it. But essentially, you want to dig. You want to dig and almost ask why too much, like almost an awkward amount, right? Because it's about understanding. And then the fifth and probably the most important step, when you're meeting with these folks and you're gathering all these insights, you're probably going to miss stuff. So if possible, ask them if it's okay if you can record some of this stuff. So it could be just a phone recorder, an audio thing if people don't like being on camera, or if they're uncomfortable with having their voice recorded, which is fine too. Write it down. Take really, really good notes, or even sometimes if you could bring someone with you, that can really help you a lot. But the key here, though, for this step is to make sure people really understand why you're doing this. And a big part of this is you're just trying to learn how it is you can help them do whatever it is they do better. Okay, the final and most powerful method for observing your customers is to actually step into their shoes, to actually empathize with them. Now, so if you're selling to parents, You're selling toys to parents, but you don't have any kids. Maybe try babysitting for a few friends. Or you're selling to athletes. Have you been hitting the gym regularly? Things like that. The best marketers understand their customers because they can relate to them. You know what it's like to be them. You know what they're going through. Maybe it's because you used to be them, or in some cases you are them. Whatever approach you choose depends on your access to these people. That's going to be a big part of it. And it may also depend on how confident you feel about how you understand them. I mean, think about this. Back in 1964, you had Nike founders Bill Bowerman and Phil Knight. Chances are they didn't go around interviewing people to necessarily build personas when they started selling athletic shoes. I mean, why? I mean, at the time, they weren't targeting people they didn't know. They weren't targeting soccer moms and NBA players. I mean, Bowerman, he was a coach at the University of Oregon and personally trained 33 track athletes and Olympians. His student and one of his athletes, Phil Knight, he had actually been one of his runners, right? So, I mean, Nike's early success grew out of their founders' intense understanding of the people they were serving. Chances are you won't be producing all the content by yourself. So when you collaborate with any of the estimated 62,000 ad agencies and all of the freelancers around there, remember one thing. These people don't know your customers like you do. They didn't go and observe. They didn't go live. They didn't go shadow. They didn't go empathize with the people you support. And when you hire another person to represent your brand, you have to make sure that they really understand very clearly who it is that you serve and why them. So in this stage of the persona loop, we simply craft short stories about the groups of people you just observed. So grab everything you recorded from your observations and let's get these personas built. So personas usually contain the following components. The first thing is a picture. We've all heard the saying, right? A picture can say 1,000 words. And it can save you a lot of time describing the types of people you serve. The second thing that your personas are going to have are what's known as demographics, right? This is the more obvious information that can help us quickly identify the people in your customer group, right? So their age, gender, occupation, where they live, things like that. The third thing we're going to want is their information sources. Where are they getting information? Who do they trust, right? Where do they get the information they care about? Do they use social media? If so, which forms? What shows do they watch? What YouTube channels do they subscribe to? What makes them choose these things over other channels? That's the fundamental reason we want to do this. The fourth thing that you'll want in their persona are psychographics. These are the worldviews. This, I think, is the bread and butter of a well-written persona. This is where we find out what they actually care about. This is what are they trying to get done? What would they hire you to do for them? What challenges are they experiencing? What bothers them? Like, what fears do they have in some cases? And then on the flip side, what aspirations do they have? What are their goals? All right, so as you create personas, here are some tips as you get started. In the psychographic section, use complete sentences. Right? Remember, these personas aren't written only for you. These personas can be used by creative agencies you work with that will help you tell your story in some way. So it's important these personas are able to kind of stand on their own, right? So your partners and the people that work on their teams, they can kind of reference your thinking when they have to make those critical design decisions about your content. The second tip, go below the surface. Psychographics are more important than demographics. It's easy usually to find out who's who, what their age is, where they shop, and even their information sources are helpful to some extent. But if you don't really get into the underlying reasons, their underlying motivations, it's going to be very difficult for you to produce convincing and compelling information that'll help a creative agency build you good stuff. So you're not just building noise. Most of us aren't buying things because we need them. We're buying these things because we want them. And remember, our desires, just like our behaviors, they're shaped by our worldviews. So a 12-year-old in Chicago may want something drastically different than a 12-year-old living in South Africa. Simply because they are 12 years old, by living in different locations, their psychographics may be completely different, right? The things that they find enjoyable, the things that they want out of, friendship at school. While there are a lot of commonalities, it's those subtle differences that are going to help push your product somewhere into a niche and more into an interesting segment, if you will. The third tip, when you're creating these personas, don't ever fill out a persona with a customer. Don't ever ask them to do it for you. These personas represent your version of your client's story. So telling her about your views on her life and challenges might leave people a little bit uncomfortable. So the fourth tip, limit the number of personas you use to about 5. You can have 1, 2, but try not to have more than 5. Honestly, just too many, it just becomes a hassle. You can try and segment people so many different ways, but after a while, it'll just become too confusing and it'll kind of be counterintuitive, right? It's kind of like the law of diminishing returns, right? At some point, it just kind of tailors off. And I found it's usually around 5 is where you've reached your limit. The fifth and probably the most important tip that I can give you about these personas is to use them. Use them in everyday conversation. Print them out, have their pictures on your walls, or constantly remind your team of who these personas are. Use them in your conversation, right? We give these personas names so that you can actually refer to them when you're making design decisions with, maybe it is an ad agency, maybe it's just some folks on your team about a certain product or a feature that you're working on. But just filling it out and saying, hey, we did our persona, done. That doesn't work like that. These are built to reinforce what it is that, the assumptions you're making about your customers, but without constant use and reuse and actually embedding them in how you do work, you're not going to see the same results. So I think a really good example of this is Jeff Bezos of Amazon. At every board meeting, he asks all of the members in the room to make sure that there's one chair that's left empty, and they will bring another chair in if they take up all of them. And the reason being, it's to remind them. This empty chair is to remind everyone in that room of the most important person who wasn't able to make it. In their case, it's their customer. And I know it seems silly and maybe a little exaggerated, but that phrase, out of sight, out of mind, this is where that matters here. Okay, so for the third step of the persona loop, validate. Validate, validate, validate. We said it's a cycle. You can make observations, you can make inferences about those observations, but you have to be able to validate that thing. And that's where this loop comes into play. And the fact that it's really to remind you that this isn't just something that you just do once and you forget about. So you need to ask yourself, do you still believe in the narratives you constructed, all those months ago? Are those even the right people for you to address anymore? Do they really want what it is you're offering? It's important to not anchor yourself too much to any one of these personas. They're constantly going to be in flux, and you should constantly be learning about your customers to understand, and people change. And more importantly, worldviews change. And if you don't understand that, chances are you could be producing products that people don't really care about anymore. Something that I try to remind myself of, and the people I work with constantly, is that our customers don't owe us anything. And you don't want to necessarily count on them to think they do. People will respond to the work you do differently than you might expect, right? And you want to use these moments as a time to dig. If a conversation doesn't go the way you expect, or a customer isn't responding the way you'd like, don't argue or disagree or try and ignore them. It's press them on why they feel that way, and then figure out. Bring some of those interview questions that we talked about from the observe phase back to the front. Assume that mindset of a journalist, right? It's that whole speak as though you're right, listen as though you're wrong. So Seth Godin, he has this incredible list of why people don't choose certain products or companies. It's kind of like Maslow's hierarchy of needs, except for marketers. And what I mean by that is a lot of business leaders think that the big issue they face when it comes to marketing is that people just don't know about them. They're like, oh, we need to get the word out. And I think a lot of us may not realize that even if you do manage to get people's attention, there are still so many other worldviews between you and your customer. And as you read through this list, I put it below, I want you to think, how many of these have to do with your perception of your customers? Not the other way around, right? It's not so much their perception of you, it's more of how are you understanding them? So my point in sharing all this is that it's important that we not lie to ourselves. These personas aren't going to have a grading rubric. No one is going to tell you if you got all the answers right. Honestly, the best way to know if your persona is any good is to look at your sales. Okay, so to recap what we covered, worldviews are important. Why? Because they shape our beliefs and our behaviors, which includes our buying behaviors. Personas help us communicate to others what our customers' worldviews are in the first place. Maintaining good personas involves 3 cyclical stages: observing your customers, making inferences about what you've observed, and validating your assumptions over time. Now, I've included some documents to help you get started and a few links to some resources I found helpful if you want to explore a little bit more. If you have any questions or you need any help, just shoot me a note and let's talk. Thanks.